I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a bank statement with my name on it, staring at 11 years of withdrawals I never made. My hands weren't shaking. That's the part that scared me. Because somewhere between reading the first line and the last, I had gone completely, utterly calm. The kind of calm that only comes when the worst thing you ever imagined turns out to be true. Not the panicked, gasping kind of calm you perform when you're trying to hold yourself together in public. The other kind. The deep, still, airless kind. Like the silence after a car accident, when your body hasn't yet decided what it's going to feel, and the world just stops. I stood there in that kitchen. My kitchen, the kitchen I had picked out the tile for. The kitchen where I had made 1,000 Sunday meals and packed 100 work lunches and stood at the counter at 6 a.m. with coffee, watching the sun come up over the backyard. And I read that number at the bottom of the transaction history report one more time. And then I set the paper down on the counter very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and I thought, so this is what it looks like. This is what 11 years of being managed looks like when the paper finally tells the truth. If this story found you right when you needed it, if something about this moment hits a little too close to home, I want you to know you're not alone. You don't have to explain everything. You don't have to share details. But if you've ever stood in a moment like this, drop a comment. Even just a word. And if you feel comfortable, tell me where you're watching from, your city and country. Because seeing that reminds me none of us are really alone in this. And if stories like this speak to you, real, raw moments that don't get talked about enough, consider subscribing. This channel exists because people like you show up and listen. Knowing someone else has been there, has made it through, that matters more than you think. And before we get into what really happened, just know this. I got through it. Now let me tell you how. Let me start at the beginning, because this story doesn't begin in that kitchen. It doesn't begin with the bank statement, or the account number, or the wire transfers that I had looked at without seeing for over a decade. It begins much earlier than that. It begins with a girl who grew up watching her mother apologize to landlords. My name is Carmen Reyes Holloway. I grew up in South Dallas, not the nice part, not the part people mean when they say Dallas like it's a postcard. I grew up in the part where the grocery stores had bars on the windows, and the bus ran late, and the neighbors knew each other's business, because the walls between apartments were thin as paper. We were not poor in the catastrophic, falling through the floor kind of way. We were poor in the grinding, every month is a math problem kind of way. The kind of poor that doesn't make headlines. The kind that just wears you down slowly over years, until the people inside it start to look smaller than they actually are. My mother, Elena Reyes, was the strongest woman I have ever known, and she worked 2 jobs her entire adult life and still couldn't get ahead of the numbers. She worked days at a hotel laundry facility in Irving, folding and pressing sheets for 12 hours, her hands red and cracked from the industrial soap. And she worked nights 3 days a week at a convenience store on the edge of our neighborhood, standing behind bulletproof glass, selling lottery tickets to people who believed their luck was about to change. She did this without complaint. She did this with a kind of dignity that I didn't have words for when I was a child, but that I understand completely now. The dignity of a woman who has decided that her circumstances do not define her character, and who acts accordingly every single day regardless of the cost to herself. I watched her. I watched everything she did. I watched how she handled money, carefully, precisely, with no margin for error and no room for optimism. And I watched how that carefulness still wasn't enough, because carefulness alone cannot compensate for structural disadvantage. And I watched what it cost her in the private hours, the hours after she thought I was asleep, when she sat at the kitchen table with the bills and the calculator, and sometimes her face would just go somewhere else for a moment. Somewhere far away. And then she'd come back and she'd add up the column again. I made myself a promise when I was 16 years old. It was a Tuesday night in October. I had come home from school and I could hear her through the wall of her bedroom. She didn't know I was home yet. The bus had dropped me early, and she was crying. Not the dramatic, heaving kind of crying. The worst kind. The quiet, exhausted kind that people do when they've been holding something for so long that it just starts leaking out. I stood in the hallway with my backpack on, and I listened. And I made myself listen, because I knew instinctively that looking away from that sound would be a kind of lie. My mother was crying through a wall because she was $52 short on the electric bill, and the due date was the next day, and she didn't know how to close the gap. I made myself a promise that night that I would build something real. Not just money, something structural. Something that no circumstance could dismantle, and no person could simply take. I would understand finances. I would be rigorous. I would be the woman in the room who knew the numbers better than anyone else, who never had to apologize to a landlord, who never had to make herself small to get through a month. I was 16. I kept that promise. I put myself through community college working nights at a logistics company in Irving, entry level, filing and data entry, but it was inside an industry I understood instinctively, the movement of goods, the management of systems. I was promoted within a year. I enrolled in night classes for business and supply chain management. I got my associate's degree and then went back for more credits while working full-time. I was relentless in the specific way that people are relentless when they have something to prove, and the thing they're proving it to is a memory of their mother crying through a wall. By 28, I was supervising a team of 9 people at a regional distribution hub in Garland. By 30, I was running the receiving department with 23 direct reports and a scope of responsibility that I was genuinely proud of. I had my own apartment, a 1-bedroom in a complex in Mesquite, nothing fancy, but mine in every way that mattered. Clean, organized, every drawer in its place. I paid my bills on time. I had a small savings account that I contributed to every month without exception, even when it meant eating rice and beans for the last week of the month. I had built the foundation I had promised 16-year-old Carmen she would have. And then I met Ryan. I met Ryan Holloway at a supply chain logistics conference in Austin in late October, 9 years into my career. He was attending on behalf of his company. He worked in regional sales for a construction materials distributor, and we ended up at the same round table at a networking lunch on the second day. 2 people who clearly had no interest in the formal agenda and were both looking for an excuse to have an actual conversation instead. He was easy to be with from the first hour. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I try to understand how I could have missed what was directly in front of me for so long. The answer is always the same, and the answer is that he was genuinely, naturally easy to be with. He listened. He asked follow-up questions. He didn't dominate conversation or perform confidence or check his phone when you were mid-sentence. He was from a small town outside Waco, he told me over lunch, and he had that small-town quality of being comfortable with silence, of not needing to fill every gap with noise. He had brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed, and he laughed at the right moments. Not the polite, social laughs, but the real ones that come from being actually surprised by something funny. He drove a clean truck. He had a firm handshake. He opened the door to the conference room when we happened to be leaving at the same time. These are small things. I know they are small things. But when you have spent a lifetime building discipline and seriousness and rigor, and then you meet someone who makes the air feel lighter just by being in the room, that is not a small thing. That feels like finding something you had stopped believing existed. We exchanged numbers at the conference. He texted me that same evening, nothing elaborate, just a reference to something we'd laughed about at lunch, and I sat in my hotel room in Austin and thought, okay, this one might be something. We dated for 2 years before their engagement. Proper dating, dinner and conversation and weekends, visiting each other's cities, and the slow, careful process of letting someone into the architecture of your actual life rather than just the curated version. I introduced him to my mother, who made tamales, and studied him with the quiet precision of a woman who has learned to read people accurately through decades of reading them for survival. She liked him. She told me in Spanish, quietly, in the kitchen, while Ryan talked to my cousin in the living room, that he had kind eyes and a respectful manner, and that he seemed like a man who would work hard for the people he loved. I introduced him to my best friend Priscilla, who was more skeptical by nature, and asked him approximately 45 pointed questions over the course of our first dinner together, and then called me afterward and said, "Okay, I can't find anything wrong with him," in a tone that suggested she had genuinely tried. I introduced him to my cousin Adriana, who was 22 at the time and direct in the way that only people under 25 can be, and she said simply, "He's solid, Carmen. He's actually solid," and meant it as the highest possible compliment. He met my mother twice more before their engagement. Each time he was exactly the same, attentive, warm, interested in her stories, unhurried. He helped with dishes without being asked. He remembered the name of her coworker, she'd mentioned the visit before, and asked how that situation had resolved. These are not the behaviors of a man performing goodness for an audience. These are the behaviors of a man who is genuinely good. Or so I believed. And in the interest of being fully honest, I still believe that some of that goodness was real. Ryan was not a monster. That's one of the most complicated things about this story, and one of the things I've had to sit with the longest. He was not a bad man in the way we usually mean that phrase. He was something more nuanced and ultimately more damaging. A man who loved his mother more than he loved honesty. A man who had been shaped so completely by her narrative of him. Ryan the sensitive one, Ryan who needed protecting, Ryan around whom the world should bend, that when she asked him to do something wrong, he did not experience it as a moral choice. He experienced it as loyalty. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That understanding came much later. Ryan proposed in the spring, 2 years after Austin, over dinner at a restaurant in Fort Worth that he'd made a reservation at 3 weeks in advance. He had told my mother beforehand. I found out about that afterward from her, and it made me love him in a specific and particular way that is hard to describe. He had driven to see her alone, without me, and asked for her blessing in the formal way that her generation understood and honored, and she had given it to him with both hands. We got married in April, outdoor ceremony, Fort Worth Botanical Garden, just over 120 guests, a string quartet, my cousin Adriana doing the floral arrangements because she has a gift for it, and because I wanted something made by someone who loved me in every corner of that day. Ryan's eyes went red the moment he saw me at the top of the aisle. His best man, his college friend Derek, had to hand him a handkerchief. The whole crowd sort of exhaled at once, the way they do when the moment is real enough that everyone in the room feels it simultaneously. Linda sat in the front row in a powder blue dress. I remember looking at her during the ceremony, briefly, just a glance, and she was smiling. A full, open smile. I thought, this is my family now. I thought, we are going to be fine. I want to tell you about the first time I met Linda, because, in retrospect, it contains everything you need to understand about what came later, if you know how to read it. At the time, I didn't know how to read it. I had no framework for what she was, because I had not encountered it in that precise form before. Ryan had spoken about his mother with a particular quality of reverence. Not healthy filial love. I understood that. I had deep love for my own mother, but something more total. Something that left no space for complexity. In Ryan's telling, Linda was a woman who had sacrificed everything for her children after her husband passed. Ryan was 11 when his father died of a heart attack. Sudden, no warning, and who had held the family together through pure force of will and love. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a local insurance office. She had managed their small house in Waco on a limited income. She had been there for every school event, every game, every crisis, always there, always present, always giving. She gave up everything for us, Ryan told me once, and I remember nodding and thinking, what a remarkable woman. I met this remarkable woman at Christmas, the December before our wedding, at her house in Waco. A small, tidy ranch-style house on a quiet street, decorated for the holidays with a real tree and a ceramic nativity set, and stockings hung from the mantel with wooden letters. She was 70 at the time, petite, silver-haired, well put together, with the bearing of a woman who had always understood that presentation was a form of communication. She shook my hand warmly when we arrived and immediately moved to take my coat, and said, "Carmen, I have heard so much about you. Ryan doesn't stop talking about you, and now I see why." I liked her. I want to be clear about that. I liked her that first night. She was gracious and she was funny, genuinely funny, with a dry observational humor that surprised me, and she knew how to make a person feel seen and welcome in her home. She asked about my work with what seemed like real interest. She showed me photographs of Ryan and his sister Deborah as children, narrating the stories behind them with warmth and specificity. She had made a pecan pie from scratch for dessert, Ryan's favorite, and she served it with vanilla ice cream and said, "You'll have to tell me if my son has been bragging about this pie his whole life, or if I just think he has." And I laughed and said the pie was extraordinary, and it was. But there was something. I registered something that evening that I did not have language for, and so I filed it away in a part of my mind and did not examine it closely. It was in her eyes specifically. Not when she was talking, but in the small moments between talking. When she was listening, when she was watching Ryan and me interact, when she thought no one was looking at her face. A quality of surveillance. The difference between being in a room with someone who is enjoying the room and being in a room with someone who is monitoring it. Ryan's sister Deborah was there. Deborah was 4 years younger than Ryan, married to a quiet man named Greg, who worked for a utility company in Waco, mother of 2 kids who spent most of the evening in another room watching a movie. Deborah was pleasant and straightforward, the kind of woman who is competent without needing to perform it, and I liked her immediately in a less complicated way than I liked Linda. Toward the end of the evening, as we were waiting for our coats in Linda's narrow hallway, Deborah looked at me with an expression I would only decode much later. An expression that contained equal parts apology, warning, and resignation. And she said, "She's going to love you as long as you don't threaten her." I laughed, thinking it was the kind of light, affectionate joke people make about mothers who are protective of their sons. The kind of joke that acknowledges something real, but gives it a harmless shape. Deborah smiled back, but her smile didn't reach the same place the joke had, and the moment passed, and we collected our coats, and I thought nothing more of it for a very long time. We bought our house in Garland 16 months after the wedding. 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, brick front, attached garage, cul-de-sac street on the northeast side of Dallas. The yard was bigger than I'd expected in our price range, and there was a live oak tree in the backyard that the previous owners had strung with lights, and I made Ryan promise we would keep the lights up year-round. The kitchen had been recently updated. Granite counters, subway tile backsplash, stainless appliances, and I stood in it on the walkthrough and thought of my mother's kitchen in South Dallas. The linoleum floor with the worn-through patch near the stove, the drawer that never closed all the way, the window above the sink that faced the brick wall of the adjacent apartment building and let in almost no light. This kitchen faced a backyard. This kitchen had a window that let in the full morning sun. I signed the closing documents with my hand, completely steady, and my heart doing something complicated and private that I didn't try to put into words. Here is where I need to slow down and be very specific about money, because the details matter and I want you to understand exactly how it worked, both because it's important to the story and because I suspect that some of you, more of you than would feel comfortable raising your hand, may be living inside a version of this right now without knowing it. Ryan and I had a direct conversation about finances 2 months before the wedding, prompted by me, because I was not going to walk into a marriage without a clear, shared understanding of how we would manage our money. I had spent too many years building financial discipline to hand it over to chance or assumption. I drafted an actual agenda for that conversation. I know that sounds extremely type A, and it is, and I am, and I make no apologies for it. And we sat down on a Sunday afternoon with coffee and I went through it. We agreed on a joint checking account for all household expenses, mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, car maintenance, everything that kept the house running. We agreed to maintain small individual accounts for personal spending, clothes, personal grooming, gifts, whatever each person needed without having to justify it to the other, funded by a monthly transfer from the joint account, equal amounts for both of us. We agreed that I would handle the budget management, tracking, and bill payments, not because Ryan couldn't do it, but because he genuinely disliked it and I genuinely did not. It was a division of labor that made sense for our specific skills and preferences. "You're the smart one with money," Ryan said that afternoon, and I heard it as a compliment, as a recognition of a real capability that I had worked hard to develop, and I accepted it as such. I think now about how precisely that statement was designed, whether consciously or not, to position me as the person responsible for any financial outcomes, while simultaneously creating the impression that Ryan was simply the less capable partner who had wisely deferred to my superior abilities. It was flattering. It was also a cage built around a very specific kind of blind spot. Because here is what happens when you are responsible for managing a household budget, and you are genuinely good at it, and the numbers are working. You stop auditing with paranoia, and you start auditing with competence. The two feel similar from the outside, but they produce entirely different outcomes. Competence says, I can see that the categories are in range and the account is healthy, therefore the system is working. Paranoia says, show me every single transaction and I want to see where it went. I was competent. I was not paranoid. And the gap between those two approaches was exactly the space that Linda used. The account at First Horizon Bank was opened 8 months after our wedding. I know this because I eventually saw the records. Ryan drove to Waco on a weekend in January. I remember the weekend. It was a 3-day holiday weekend. I had stayed home to work on a project. And he and Linda walked into a First Horizon branch in Waco together, presented their IDs, and opened a joint savings account. Their account was listed as a personal savings account in both names. There was no documentation of purpose, no conversation with me, no mention of it that evening when Ryan came home and said he'd had a nice visit and Linda sent her love. The first transfer from our joint account to that account number happened 6 weeks later. $75. It was labeled in our transaction history with an alphanumeric code, something like EFT PMT 847,623, the kind of generic, automated-looking label that appears on external transfers and bill payments, and that I had been trained by years of competent budgeting to scan rather than scrutinize. $75 out of a household account with a healthy balance registered as noise. It disappeared into the category of general expenses, the way a single word disappears into a paragraph you're skimming. The amounts varied. That was deliberate, I believe, because regular, consistent amounts create patterns that even a casual reviewer might eventually notice. But amounts that vary, 75 one month, 120 the next, then a gap, then 200, those look like ordinary household variability. That look like a higher electricity bill one month and a car repair the next. They look like life. I want to pause here and tell you something about Linda that I think is important for understanding why this worked for as long as it did. Because I don't want you to picture a villain who operated from the shadows, who was absent and cold and obviously sinister. That is not who Linda was. Linda was present. Linda was warm. Linda was a grandmother figure in the making, or at least performed that role with extraordinary commitment, and the performance was indistinguishable from the real thing in the moments when you were inside it. She visited more frequently as the years passed. What started as occasional weekend visits stretched into longer stays. A week here, 10 days there, sometimes more when she had a health issue or a reason that required Ryan's attention. And she was helpful when she visited, genuinely helpful in a way I could not complain about without sounding petty. She did laundry. She cooked. She cleaned the bathrooms without being asked. She brought gifts, small, thoughtful ones, nothing expensive, a book she thought I'd like, a candle in a scent she'd remembered I mentioned once, a handmade card for a birthday. She was the picture of the invested, loving mother-in-law. She also had opinions. I need to give this section its full weight, because the opinions were not separate from the financial scheme. They were part of it. They were the structural support for it. And without them, Ryan might have felt the guilt of what he was doing rather than having it reframed as something necessary and justified. The opinions came in softly. They arrived as concern, as maternal wisdom, as innocent observations from a woman who only wanted the best for her son and for our marriage. They came when I wasn't in the room, mostly. I know this because Deborah eventually told me, because Deborah had been present for many of them. But sometimes they came in front of me, which required a different kind of delivery. When delivered in front of me, they were coated in so much warmth and so much plausible goodwill that I genuinely could not tell in the moment whether I was being manipulated or simply in the presence of a well-meaning woman with different opinions than mine. She had opinions about my work hours. Carmen works so hard, she would say to Ryan, in a tone that managed to sound like admiration while landing in the ears like concern. I just hope she's not wearing herself thin. You need someone present, Ryan. You've always needed that. Your father was the same way. She never said, Carmen works too much. She said, I hope Carmen is okay, and let the implication that Ryan was being neglected do its work without her fingerprints on it. She had opinions about money. Specifically, she had opinions about the way I managed our money that she delivered to Ryan in the private hours. In the evenings after I had gone to bed, or on the phone during the days, she was back in Waco between visits, or during Ryan's solo trips to see her. She described me, I would learn years later from Deborah, as secretive with finances. She worried, she said, that I kept money too close to the chest. She referenced conversations, entirely fictional, conversations that had never taken place, in which I had allegedly expressed that the money was mine and that Ryan should be grateful for what I provided. She said she just hoped Ryan was protected. She said it with love. She said it with her hand over her heart. I want you to sit with that for a moment. while she was saying these things to her son, while she was painting me as controlling and secretive and potentially threatening to Ryan's financial security. She was simultaneously transferring money out of the account that held my paycheck into her own name. The woman who was describing me as the financial threat was the actual financial threat. And she was so certain, apparently, in the rightness of what she was doing that she never seemed to feel the contradiction. Year 3 of our marriage, I received a performance review at work that resulted in a significant salary increase and a new title. I was made Regional Operations Director for the Southwest Division, managing a team across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. More responsibility, more visibility, more money, and more travel. I was gone between 3 and 5 days a month, sometimes more during major system transitions or audits. Ryan seemed proud of me. He told me he was proud of me. He took me to dinner to celebrate and gave a small, genuine toast about how I had worked for this since before he knew me and how he had never doubted I'd get here. I believed him. I still believe he meant it in that moment. But somewhere in the gap between what he said to me and what he reported to his mother, the narrative transformed. Because Linda's response to my promotion, the way she framed it to Ryan in subsequent conversations, according to Deborah, was to intensify her concern about Ryan's protection. A woman with more earning power, Linda suggested, was a woman with more options. And a woman with more options needed to be planned around. The transfers increased after my promotion. Not dramatically, there was no sudden spike that would have tripped any alarm, but steadily. From the previous average of around $150 a month to closer to $250. $250 a month from a household account that was flush with a director-level income looks like absolutely nothing. It dissolves into the operational noise of a house and 2 people and a mortgage and 2 cars and a dog we got in year 4. A rescue mutt named Biscuit, who cost us a fortune in vet bills the first year and became the most beloved member of our household. Biscuit was how I first began to understand something was slightly off with Ryan, though I didn't frame it that way at the time. It happened at the emergency vet. He had eaten something in the backyard. We thought maybe a mushroom, and we were up until 2 in the morning in the animal hospital waiting room while they monitored him. And in the exhausted, strange intimacy of that waiting room, Ryan and I talked for a long time about things we hadn't talked about in a while. And at some point Ryan said something that I have turned over many times since. I just want to make sure we're okay, long term, that we're protected. I thought he meant Biscuit. I pivoted the conversation to our emergency savings and our pet insurance policy and how we were absolutely fine. But he nodded in a way that didn't entirely match what I'd said, like he'd asked a different question than the one I'd answered. And then the vet came out to tell us Biscuit was going to be fine, and the moment passed. He meant something else. I know that now. Year 5, Ryan's mother had what the family initially thought might be a minor stroke. It turned out to be a severe tension headache and elevated blood pressure. Not a stroke, but there was a terrifying 48 hours before the doctors got clarity on that. Ryan flew to Waco immediately, and I drove up the following afternoon when I could get out of a meeting I couldn't reschedule. I sat in that hospital waiting room with Linda's sister Helen and Ryan and Deborah and Greg, and I held Linda's hand when we were allowed to see her, and I meant it. Whatever complicated thing I was beginning to feel in the background of our marriage, I genuinely did not want this woman to be suffering. She was Ryan's mother. She was part of my family. I held her hand and I told her she was going to be fine, and she looked at me with those assessing eyes and said, "You're a good girl, Carmen. Ryan is lucky." I thought she meant it. Maybe she did. Maybe she could hold 2 things at once: genuine fondness for me as a person and a complete willingness to take from me anyway. In the way that some people compartmentalize their affections from their behaviors so completely that there's no felt contradiction. I have thought about this a great deal. I don't have a clean answer. After the health scare, Linda's visits increased again. She started coming down to Garland, not just for special occasions, but for ordinary stretches of weeks. And Ryan encouraged it. And I continued to accommodate it because I could not find language for what bothered me that did not make me sound like exactly the woman Linda had described to Ryan. Complaining about his mother's presence would make me the controlling wife. Raising concerns about how often she visited would make me the woman who was trying to separate him from his family. The frame had been built so carefully that any movement within it confirmed the frame. I was not conscious of this dynamic at the time. I only understood it retrospectively, which is one of the cruelest aspects of this kind of manipulation. It is only visible when you are outside it. Year 6 into the marriage, I hired a financial planner. This was my own initiative, unilateral, something I decided to do because we were at the point in our lives where retirement planning needed to become more serious than a monthly 401k contribution. And I wanted professional guidance on the full picture. Estate planning, investment allocation, mortgage strategy, the works. I invited Ryan to the first meeting. He came and was attentive enough, but deferred to me throughout in a way that I now recognize as deliberate. He had no interest in examining the full picture, because the full picture contained something he needed to stay hidden. The financial planner reviewed our accounts and our cash flow and said we were in solid shape, and we walked out of that meeting together and Ryan said, "See, we're fine. We don't need to worry," and I agreed, and we went to lunch. The financial planner had looked at our joint account, our individual accounts, our 401ks, our mortgage. She had not looked at the First Horizon account. There was no reason for her to look at an account that neither of us had mentioned, that existed at a different institution, under different names. It wasn't in the picture. We had presented her with an incomplete picture, and she had assessed it accurately. The picture we showed her was fine. The part we didn't show her, the part Ryan was hiding in plain sight behind a generic EFT label, was a different story entirely. Year 7. I want to tell you about a specific dinner because it stays with me. It was Thanksgiving. We hosted that year. We had hosted most years, actually, because our house was the largest and I was the most organized. And I genuinely liked the ritual of cooking a big meal and having a full table. Linda was there and Deborah and Greg and their kids, and my mother, who had driven up from South Dallas, and my cousin Adriana, and a couple of Ryan's friends and their wives. 17 people around a table I had set with real cloth napkins, and a flower arrangement Adriana had put together from the farmer's market. My mother and Linda had met a handful of times by this point. They were cordial in the way that women who have sized each other up thoroughly are cordial, warm enough on the surface, watchful underneath. My mother didn't speak much English and Linda didn't speak any Spanish, so their communication ran through me and through Ryan, which meant it was always slightly mediated, always slightly managed. That Thanksgiving, during the dinner, Linda made a comment. We had been talking about property values in Garland. One of Ryan's friends had mentioned that the market was up, that a house on his street had sold for significantly over asking, and Linda said, very pleasantly, "Well, Carmen is so smart with money. If anything ever happened, she'd be fine." She smiled when she said it. It sounded like a compliment. Ryan laughed a little uncomfortably. Deborah looked at her plate. If anything ever happened. I noticed the phrase. I filed it away. I did not yet know what it meant. My mother noticed it too. She found me in the kitchen an hour later, when I was cutting the pie, and she said in Spanish quietly, "That woman thinks about the end of things." I asked her what she meant. She said, "She is always calculating. I can see it. She is always asking, what do I get?" I told my mother she was being protective, that Linda was just an older woman who worried about her son, that it was okay. My mother looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Carmen, you are smart about everything except people who want something from you." She picked up a plate and walked back out to the dining room. I have thought about that sentence approximately every day since October of last year. Year 8 was the year Ryan's income declined. He was honest about it in the sense that he told me his numbers were down. His sales commission structure made his income variable, and a stretch of slow quarters hit them hard. He was not honest about the degree to which this affected his state of mind, or the degree to which he processed that fear through his mother, or the degree to which his mother's response to that fear was to reach more deeply into the account rather than less. I know now, from the financial records, from the timeline, from what Deborah told me in pieces over the course of many conversations, that during this period, Ryan was calling Linda frequently, multiple times a week. Long calls. He was expressing anxiety about our financial situation, about feeling like he wasn't contributing equally, about feeling, I think, some low-grade shame that he was unable to fully name or address directly with me. And Linda was reassuring him every time that he was protected, that no matter what happened, he had something, that she had made sure of it. She made sure of it with my money, I said to my attorney, Veronica, when we pieced this together. Veronica nodded. That appears to be correct, she said, in the measured tone of someone who has heard many terrible things and has learned to receive them with professional steadiness. I covered more of our household expenses that year without complaint. I adjusted the budget, absorbed the difference, made sure we were not in any position of real stress. I took on a consulting project that added income. I was the partner who made things work. And while I was doing that, while I was quietly shoring up our finances and making sure we never missed a mortgage payment and never stressed about the utility bill, the transfers out of our joint account to Linda's account increased by an average of 30%. The year Ryan's income was lowest is the year the most money left our household for their account. I have asked myself many times what Ryan told himself during those years. What story did he construct that made this feel acceptable, or at least survivable? My best understanding, and this is partly Deborah's account and partly my own reading of a man I spent 11 years studying, is that he didn't think of it as taking. He thought of it as insurance. He had been raised by a woman who framed every decision through the lens of what happened when things went wrong, who talked constantly about being protected and safe, and who had planted the idea early and consistently that I was a risk rather than a partner. In that framework, having a separate account, money that was theirs, Linda's and his, was not stealing from me. It was surviving me. It was the plan B that his mother had always told him a smart person kept. The tragedy of that framing is that there was never anything for him to survive from. I had never threatened his financial security. I had never been controlling with money. If anything, I gave him more latitude and independence than most financial managers would. I had never suggested I would cut him off from anything or anyone. I had been, by any objective measure, a steady, generous, financially responsible partner who had grown our household wealth consistently across 11 years. The threat Linda described existed entirely in the story she told him. And he believed the story more than he believed the evidence standing in front of him every morning. Year 9. Linda's kidney stone. I want to be precise. She was hospitalized for 4 days in March of that year. It was genuinely unpleasant. Kidney stones are enormously painful, and the treatment is no one's idea of a good time. And Ryan went to Waco immediately, and I followed a day later, and we were there, both of us, for the hospitalization and the discharge and the first couple of days of her recovery at home. I cooked for her. I changed the sheets on her bed. I sat with her in the evenings, while Ryan helped Greg with a repair project in the yard. She was different during those days. Softer. More direct. At one point she took my hand. We were sitting in her living room, the television on low, Ryan still outside, and she said, "You're a good woman, Carmen. I know I'm not always easy." I looked at her. I said she was family, and I was happy to be there. She nodded and squeezed my hand and looked at the television screen, and I thought, maybe this is the beginning of something better between us. Maybe the health scare has softened something. The transfers jumped to $450 a month for the 6 months following her hospitalization. The closest thing I have to an explanation for that particular escalation is that the health scare reminded Linda of her own mortality, and she responded to that reminder by accelerating the extraction. She was not softened. She was motivated. By year 10, the cumulative total had crossed $80,000. I did not know this. What I knew by year 10 was a different, vaguer thing, a gathering accumulation of small frictions, small silences, small moments of disconnection with Ryan that I could not isolate and name, but that lived in the texture of our marriage like a low-grade temperature. We were not unhappy, not in any obvious way. We did not fight. We did not have the kinds of conversations that, when reported to a therapist, would prompt immediate alarm. We had date nights and vacations, and easy Sunday mornings, and inside jokes that had survived a decade of use. We were, to every observer and to most of our own daily experience, a solid couple. But something was slightly off. Some quality of full presence that had existed in our early years had thinned out, and I could never pin down the cause. And I told myself it was just the natural evolution of a long marriage, that the intensity of new love always becomes something quieter and more ordinary. That quieter and more ordinary was not the same as broken. I told myself this, and I mostly believed it. The water heater was in the second year of what I think of as the end game, though I didn't know at the time that anything was ending or beginning. Our water heater died on a Tuesday in March. It was a Thursday before anyone had time to deal with it, which meant 2 cold shower mornings, which meant I was in a mildly bad mood by the time the topic came up substantively. Ryan said he had a contact, a friend of a friend who did appliance installation, did it on the side, gave good prices. I said fine. 2 weeks later, the new water heater was installed, and it worked perfectly, and I went to reconcile the household account, and the payment wasn't there. I asked Ryan. He said he'd paid cash. I asked where the cash came from. He said his mother had given him some, birthday money, had been sitting in his wallet. I looked at him. He looked back at me. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds and then resolved, because I chose to let it resolve, because I was tired and I had a report due the next morning, and the water heater worked and the amount, $1,840, while not trivial, was not so alarming that I felt equipped to start a conflict over it in the middle of a week that was already full. I regret that choice. Not catastrophically. It didn't change the ultimate outcome, I believe, because the outcome was already written in 11 years of paper trails. But I regret it because some part of me knew. Some part of me had been knowing for longer than I want to admit. I had been choosing not to know, which is different from not knowing, and the distinction matters to me even now. My cousin Adriana came to visit in October. She arrived on a Wednesday with a suitcase and a box of tamales from a place in South Dallas she still went back for. And for the first 3 days, the visit was what it always was. Easy, warm, full of the particular shorthand that exists between people who have known each other since childhood, who share a language and a history and a sensibility. We cooked together, watched television, argued affectionately about a movie we both remembered differently, took Biscuit for a long walk on Saturday morning. On the second night of her visit, after Ryan had gone to bed, we were at the kitchen table with a bottle of red wine and the particular openness that comes at 11 p.m. between women who genuinely trust each other. The kitchen was quiet. The light above the table was the only one on. Biscuit was asleep against my feet under the table. And Adriana said, "Can I ask you something without you getting defensive?" I knew what that question meant. It meant, this is real and I've been sitting with it. "Ask," I said. She set her wine glass down and folded her hands on the table and told me that she had run into Deborah. Not on purpose. They had overlapped at a baby shower for a mutual friend in Waco, of all the absurd coincidences. They talked for a while, the way people do at events where they don't know many others. And Deborah had said something to Adriana that Adriana had been carrying for 3 weeks before she felt sure enough to bring it to me. Deborah had told her that at a family gathering in Waco, a birthday party for one of Greg's relatives, Linda had said something to a small group that she clearly thought of as a safe audience. She had said, regarding Ryan's marriage, that no matter what Carmen decides to do, Ryan would be protected. She had said there was money set aside. She had been specific enough about the amount. Deborah had heard the word enough, and a number she couldn't quite make out, but that started with 8. That Deborah had felt uneasy. Not alarmed enough at the time to call me, but uneasy. "I don't know what it means," Adriana said. "Maybe it's nothing. Maybe Linda is just a nervous old woman who talks too much." But Deborah was bothered by it, and now I'm bothered by it, and I need you to tell me you've looked at everything and it's fine. I said, "I'm going to look at everything." I did not sleep that night. Ryan went to bed at 10:30. By 11, I had my laptop open at the kitchen table. I started with the most recent 6 months of our joint account, not a normal review, a granular one, every single transaction, every single line item. I was looking for I didn't know what. I was looking for the thing I had not looked for in 11 years of competent, non-paranoid reviewing. It took me almost 2 hours to find it, because I found a dozen other things first. Things that were fine, that were explainable, that were the ordinary debris of a household budget. And I almost closed the laptop twice out of the fatigue of looking at numbers after midnight. But I kept going. I had Adriana's face in my mind, her careful, serious expression when she'd asked me to look, and I kept going. What I found, eventually, was not dramatic on its face. It was a transfer code I had seen hundreds of times. EFT PMT 847,623. It appeared in our transaction history with unsettling regularity. Not every month, not in a pattern so clean that any reasonable person would have noticed it without reason to look. But when I searched specifically for that code, isolated it from the rest, and mapped it across months and years, the pattern was unmistakable. I wrote the account number down on a piece of paper. My hand was completely steady. I opened a spreadsheet, and I entered every instance of that transfer code that appeared in the records I could access. 12 months back. Then I requested older records through the bank's online archive. 24 months. 36. I built a column. I totaled it. I sat with the total for a long time. Then I went to the bank's secure messaging system, and I sent a message requesting a complete transfer history for that specific external account number, going back as far as the records allowed. I wrote the message in the calm, precise tone of a woman who handles financial documentation professionally, which I do, which was genuine, even in that moment. The report arrived the next morning at 10:47 a.m. I had gone to work because I had meetings I couldn't cancel without explanation, and I had sat through those meetings in a state of surface professionalism and internal controlled suspension. Waiting, not thinking, just waiting. I checked my phone between sessions. When the email arrived, I excused myself to the restroom and opened it. 11 years. The report covered 11 years of transactions to a savings account at First Horizon Bank, held jointly under the names Ryan Joseph Holloway and Linda Ann Holloway. The first transfer was dated 8 months after our wedding. The last transfer appeared 4 days prior. The report included a total at the bottom of the page, helpfully calculated. $94,217. I read it 4 times. The number did not change. I put my phone in my pocket and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, not for drama, just because I needed to see a face, and mine was the only one available. And then I went back to my meeting. I called Priscilla from my car in the parking garage at 5:15 that afternoon. I said, I need you to find me a divorce attorney, someone good, today if possible. Priscilla said, I'm calling right now. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't say, are you sure, or maybe there's an explanation, or have you tried talking to him first? She called right then, from her own phone while I was still on the line with her, and she had 3 names for me within 20 minutes. And the first name on the list was Veronica Santos. And when I looked Veronica Santos up on my phone, I knew from the first paragraph of her professional bio that she was exactly who I needed. I want to tell you what the next 72 hours looked like, because I think people have a misconception about how women respond to this kind of discovery. The misconception is that we fall apart immediately, that we confront in tears, that we collapse under the weight of the betrayal and have to be held up by someone else until we can function again. Some women do that. It is a completely legitimate response. It is not what I did. What I did was, I went home. I made dinner, baked chicken, roasted vegetables, the kind of meal I made on autopilot, and I put it on the table and I sat across from Ryan and I watched him eat. He talked about his day. He mentioned something a coworker had said that annoyed him. He asked if I'd seen that biscuit had gotten into the recycling bin again. I said yes, I'd seen. I cleared the dishes. I asked if he wanted to watch something. We watched 45 minutes of a show we'd been working through, and then I said I was tired and I went to bed before him, which was unusual but not so unusual that it required explanation. I lay in the dark and I breathed and I made lists in my head. What I knew. What I needed to know. What I needed before I could move. I had been a logistics manager for 20 years. I understood the difference between having information and having the right information in the right order to support the action you needed to take. I was not ready to confront. I needed more. The next day I called in a half day and went to meet Veronica Santos. Veronica's office was in a professional building in North Dallas. Not ostentatious, not intimidating. The kind of office that communicates that the person inside it is serious and competent and has no need to perform those qualities through decor. She was in her late 40s, Latina, with short natural hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead. And she had the specific quality of stillness that I associate with people who spend their professional lives hearing terrible things and have learned to receive them as information rather than spectacle. I brought a folder. Everything I had, the transfer report, the account number, a timeline I had written out by hand the previous evening, documentation of the water heater incident, a summary of the financial structure of our marriage, including the direct deposit arrangement and the division of account management responsibilities. Veronica took the folder, and read it in silence for several minutes while I sat across from her and waited. When she looked up, she said, "You're organized." I said, "I've been organized my whole life. It just took me this long to organize the right information." She said, "Okay, let's talk about what Texas community property law says about this." Here is what Veronica told me, and I want to give you this information not because I am your attorney. I am not. Please consult your own legal counsel for your own situation. But because I wish someone had given it to me before I needed it. In Texas, which is a community property state, assets accumulated during a marriage are generally considered to belong equally to both spouses, regardless of whose name they are in and regardless of which spouse's income generated them. This applies to savings accounts, retirement accounts, real property, and most other asset classes. The funds that had been transferred from our joint account into the First Horizon account held by Ryan and Linda had originated in our marital income. The account itself was in Ryan's name. Under Texas law, half of the balance in that account had an arguable claim as community property. Veronica also told me that the pattern of transfers, sustained over 11 years, never disclosed to me, originating from an account that included my paychecks, could be characterized in a divorce proceeding as financial concealment or fraud within the marriage. This characterization, she explained, could influence the judge's discretion in property division. She didn't promise outcomes. She described probabilities. She told me what she'd seen in similar cases. She told me what she needed from me if we were going to file. I told her I understood. I asked her to proceed. I served Ryan the divorce papers on a Saturday morning. I had planned the timing deliberately, and I want to explain why, because I think it reveals something about the difference between reacting out of emotion and acting out of strategy. I chose Saturday because Ryan would be home without the structure of a workday to escape into. I chose morning because he would be rested and alert, and there would be no excuse of exhaustion or distraction. I had packed a bag for myself the previous evening. It was in my car, because I was not going to sleep in our house after what I was about to initiate, and I had made arrangements to stay with Priscilla. I was downstairs when he came down for coffee. I was standing at the counter, composed, the envelope in my hand. He turned from the coffee maker and saw me and whatever was on my face, not anger, not tears, something colder and steadier than either, stopped him in place. I held the envelope out. He looked at it. He looked at me. "These are divorce papers," I said. "I know about the account at First Horizon Bank in Waco. I know it's in your name and your mother's name. I know the total amount transferred there from our joint account over the last 11 years is $94,217, and I know it started 8 months after our wedding." The room was completely silent except for Biscuit, who was asleep in his dog bed in the corner and making the small, soft sounds he makes when he's dreaming. Ryan put his coffee mug down on the counter very slowly. He opened his mouth. He said, "Carmen." "Don't," I said. My voice was level. Very quiet. The quietest I had spoken in perhaps years. "Don't start with my name. You've had 11 years. You've had 11 years of mornings exactly like this one to tell me what you and your mother were doing. You've had thousands of opportunities. You chose none of them. So right now, I don't need anything from you except the name of your attorney." He cried. Ryan cried, which should not have surprised me. Ryan cried the way some men cry when they've been cornered by a truth they've been running from, not the grief of remorse exactly, but the grief of a particular kind of end. I watched him cry, and I felt very little, which is not something I am proud of, but it is the truth. By that morning, I had spent so many hours in the preceding 72 hours doing the emotional work of this discovery that there was simply not much left to feel at the sight of his tears. The grief had already moved through me, fast and private, in the middle of the night when no one was watching. He called Linda that afternoon. Deborah told me this later. Ryan called Linda, and Linda's first response, her first, immediate, unhesitating response, was not grief, was not remorse, was not the response of a woman confronting the consequences of an 11-year deception. Her response was tactical. She told Ryan to find an attorney immediately. She told him to describe the transfers as loans. She told him to say that I had known and had verbally agreed to the arrangement. She coached him on what position to take. "I want you to think about that." The scheme was exposed. Her son's marriage was ending. The woman she had stolen from for 11 years was standing in her own kitchen, holding the evidence. And Linda's first thought was the money. How to keep it. How to protect the position. Deborah was on that call. Deborah had called Ryan to check in, not knowing yet what had happened, and Ryan had not hung up before calling Linda, and Deborah heard enough. She sat with what she'd heard for 24 hours, and then she called me. She was crying when I answered. She said, "Carmen, I'm so sorry. I should have done more. I should have told you sooner." I said, "Deborah, I need to ask you something. Are you willing to talk to my attorney?" She said, without hesitating, "Yes." The legal process took 8 months from filing to settlement. Ryan retained an attorney who was competent and who tried the strategies you would expect. The verbal agreement claim, the characterization of the transfers as mutual savings, the argument that I had implicitly consented through my role as household financial manager. Each of these collapsed against the paper record. There was no written documentation of any agreement. There was not a single text message, email, or third-party account confirming I had knowledge of the First Horizon account before October of that year. Because the agreement had never existed. There had been nothing to document. Linda was deposed in April. Veronica told me the deposition was a long day. Linda had come prepared. She was composed. She answered questions carefully. She maintained her positions under follow-up with the steadiness of a woman who had been maintaining positions for a long time. But the paper record doesn't care about composure. The paper record shows a joint account opened in person by Ryan and Linda at a First Horizon branch in Waco in January, 8 months post-wedding, both government IDs presented. The paper record shows 11 years of transfers from a marital account. The paper record shows the escalations that correlated with changes in our household income. Linda could describe the transfers however she liked. The transfers described themselves. Deborah testified. She was terrified. She told me she had barely slept the week before, but she sat in that conference room and she answered questions honestly. She described the comment Linda had made at the family gathering, the specific language about Ryan being protected, the reference to a number. She described what she had heard on the phone call the morning Ryan received the papers. She cried once briefly and apologized for it, and then pulled herself back and finished. She did the hard thing. I will not forget that. The settlement was reached in November, without going to full trial. Under the terms, I retained the house, refinanced into my name alone. I received $47,108, half the account balance as of the date of filing. Ryan received the other half. I received the dog. I received a written acknowledgement, signed by Ryan's attorney, that financial transfers had occurred from the marital account over the course of the marriage without my knowledge or consent. The acknowledgement was Ryan's attorney's compromise offer in lieu of language that would have more directly characterized what had happened. Veronica advised me to accept the compromise, that the written acknowledgement served the documentary purpose I needed. I accepted it. I had it framed. It hangs on the wall of my home office in a simple black frame. I do not look at it every day. I look at it on the days when the doubt creeps in, when I wonder if I was too trusting, too slow, too focused on building my career to see what was happening in my own home. On those days, I look at that framed document and I remember, the record is clear. The record was always clear. I simply had not been given a reason to look. The morning after the settlement finalized, I woke up earlier than I needed to. The house was quiet in the particular way it is quiet when you are the only person in it. The quiet that had taken me some months to stop flinching at and to start receiving as what it actually was. Space. My space. The kitchen with the subway tile and the live oak in the backyard, and the lights we had promised to keep up year-round. All of it mine, all of it exactly as I had made it. I drove to the bakery in East Dallas. The one I had been going to since before Ryan, since before the house, since before the career had grown into what it had become. A small family operation, the kind that smells like cinnamon and butter and warm sugar from half a block away. I ordered coffee, black, and a slice of tres leches, and I sat at the corner table by the front window, and I watched the morning come in over the street outside. The traffic was light. The light was the good autumn kind, low and gold. I thought about my mother. I thought about the kitchen table in South Dallas, the calculator, the bills, the Tuesday night in October. I thought about 16-year-old Carmen in the hallway with her backpack, making a promise to herself in the dark. I thought about how that promise had never, at its core, been about money. It had been about standing upright, about building something that couldn't be taken, about being the woman who, when the worst thing happened, was still standing in the kitchen with steady hands. I thought, Mom, I didn't let them keep it. Priscilla came and found me an hour later, after I texted her the one word that had been our signal all through this process. Done. And she walked through the door of that bakery, and when she saw my face, she started crying before she reached the table. We sat there for 2 hours and talked about nothing important. Her daughter's soccer tournament, a movie she'd watched, whether we should plan something warm somewhere in the spring. Normal things. The texture of a regular life, unweighted by the thing that had been pressing down for 8 months. For a long time during this process, I had not been fully present in ordinary conversation, because there was always something enormous just underneath. That morning, for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing underneath. Just the table. Just the coffee. Just Priscilla's face and the morning light, and the sound of the city doing what cities do. I want to close with something real. Not inspiration. I am not the person you come to for inspiration. I am the person you come to for the facts of how it actually went. The real thing I want to leave you with is this. The warning signs existed. They always do, and they are always smaller and quieter, and more deniable than you would expect. They are not movie villains announcing themselves. They are patterns. A mother-in-law who describes your strengths to others as threats. A husband who praises your competence, while systematically removing himself from financial visibility. A persistent feeling, not fear exactly, not alarm, but something, that a conversation is happening just outside the range of what you can hear. A cash payment that doesn't quite add up. A comment at Thanksgiving that your mother notices even though you don't. A sister-in-law who gives you a warning, disguised as a joke, and means the warning more than the joke. You are not obligated to be suspicious of everyone you love. I am not telling you to audit your marriage like a forensic accountant. What I am telling you is that if something has been quietly pulling at you, if something has lived in the background of your life as a vague, unnamed discomfort that you have been too busy or too loyal or too tired to look at directly, you are allowed to look. You are allowed to ask for the full transaction history. You are allowed to sit at your kitchen table at midnight with a laptop and find out what the numbers say. The numbers told me the truth. They always do eventually. I just had to be willing to ask them the right question. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, if something in it landed somewhere specific and real, I need you to know that you are not alone. Drop a comment. You don't have to share your details. You don't have to tell me everything. Just knowing someone else has stood in that kitchen with that document and gotten through to the other side, that matters. That has mattered to me, hearing it from others. So if it might matter to you, I got through. The house is mine. The lights are still on the oak tree in the backyard. Stay strong. I'll see you in the next one. Subscribe, hit the bell, new stories every week. And wherever you're watching from, drop it below. I always love knowing who's in this community with me.